So another government collapses in Holland. Is the European Court of Human Rights getting too big for its boots? And Emmanuel Macron wants to ban young people from social media. Hello and welcome to the MCC Brussels Podcast. I'm, as ever, Jacob Reynolds, and delighted this week to be joined by two special guests. First of all, our Executive Director, Frank Furedi. Welcome, Frank.
Pleasure to be here.
And also delighted to welcome back to the podcast, Pieter, the Editor-in-Chief of Brussels Report.
Thank you.
Lots and lots to tackle this week, and we wanted to kick off with the news coming out of Holland. People who followed Dutch politics, it's not much of a surprise when a coalition government collapses, but this time in relatively spectacular fashion, and lots of, at least from the media reports, lots of kind of infighting among the previous coalition partners. It was all initiated by Geert Wilders deciding that he'd kind of had enough and that his policies weren't getting enough of a hearing, and so he's pulled a plug on the whole coalition government. But Pieter, I mean, you follow this more closely than I do. Could you tell us what happened, what precipitated the collapse, and what does it mean?
Well, it all started with a massive victory for Geert Wilders, the right-wing populist anti-migration party in the Netherlands, which became the biggest party. And basically, after a lot of negotiation, his party was allowed to enter government in a coalition with three other parties. You could say relatively right-wing parties as well. But they did not allow him to become prime minister because he's such a divisive figure. And frankly, he also made some mistakes himself, for example, calling for less Moroccans in the past. So I would say all of that was still sort of understandable. But then during the course of that government, everything was basically tried by the coalition partners. They denied that to prevent any meaningful immigration reforms, because that was, of course, the number one reason why Wilders was so popular. And the coalition partners, they denied that. But I can give you two examples. There were 9 European governments calling for restraining the interpretation of the Convention for Human Rights.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that later.
We're going to talk about later. Now, the Netherlands, just like Sweden and the UK, was not part of those 9 governments. Now, look, this was a very, let's say, soft letter. So you would expect that at least they would, give that small win to Wilders. They did not. Secondly, just now, after the government has already collapsed, suddenly they are able to declare Syria under certain conditions safe to go back for people that have received asylum. Now, you have to know that many people have already gone back voluntarily to Syria, particularly from Turkey. So it is a fact that for at least many people, it is a safe place. They voluntarily go there. Also, that they did not want to grant to Wilders. So I think he's right in saying that they didn't want to give him meaningful concessions. Part of the problem is the bureaucracy in the Netherlands. Now, if you are a politician there and you become a minister, you effectively only get like a spokesperson. You're completely dependent on the administration, and they are clearly hostile to Geert Wilders. And whatever I think about it, if you look at the opinion polls now after the collapse of the coalition, the party of Wilders has gained ground. So the population seemed to think that they did not want to allow meaningful migration reform.
Yeah. And Frank, I mean, one thing we've noted before, quite a few times, in fact, is that there's always a danger when kind of populist, properly nationally conservative governments are forced to enter into coalitions, that they end up kind of being brought into the system and end up watering down the very thing that kind of made them an attractive populist force to begin with. So in that case, is it kind of courageous of Wilders to actually say, no, I'm not getting what I want, I pull the plug, or is there something else at play?
Well, yeah, I think it would have been more courageous if he hadn't gone into the coalition in the first place, because it was very, very clear right from the very beginning that what they wanted to try to do was to put a technocrat in as the prime minister of Holland, and they just wanted Wilders to make up the numbers. And it seems to me that there's a dynamic that's happening everywhere in Europe, where you get populist parties who get anywhere from 18 to 29, 30%, and they don't really give them very much influence, certainly not in proportion to their electoral weight. And what they do is, well, you can, like in Sweden or elsewhere, you can join the government, but we're not going to really do very much to promote you or allow you to have any influence or any sphere. I think Italy is the prime example of this, where in many occasions they put in a technocrat as the prime minister while the coalition is trying to figure things out. So I think that Wilders had no choice but to essentially leave. I wonder whether it would have been better to have left a little bit earlier or not joined at all, because there is no way that the other political parties are going to allow him and his movement to have any profile, any serious influence. And therefore, I think that's a very interesting lesson. I think what Pieter is saying about the fact that there's growing support from in the polls is interesting, because what I was really worried about was that people would get demoralized seeing him in there as a kind of quasi-prisoner and just switch off from supporting him. But if that hasn't happened, I think that's really good.
Yeah, and Pieter, tell us a little bit more about the kind of former coalition partners. And I mean, because I remember at the time that lots of these parties were also trying to, as it were, steal some valor from Wilders, saying we're also taking migration seriously, we're going to work and really sort these issues out. But it's clear that that was kind of all just lip service.
Well, first of all, there's the center-right VVD, sort of the Tories of the Netherlands, you could say. If you look at their party program, it's very fine. It's economically liberal. They want to be tough on migration. But in practice, they often do the opposite. I mean, Mark Rutte has been the leader for a long time. Now, of course, he's off to NATO. And, I mean, I would be willing to give them the benefit of the doubt, but in practice, they have been obstructing meaningful migration reform. Then the other two parties are the Farmers' Party, and they have been a victim of a similar thing as Wilders. So their big thing is nitrogen restrictions, which are originally sort of coming from EU regulation. So basically what should happen is that the Netherlands and Belgium should force the other EU member states to change some of the old green regulations, like the habitat. I think it's a directive actually, constraining member states and forcing all kinds of unreasonable environmental obligations on them. Of course, none of that has happened. So they have been the victim of a similar thing on their topic on nitrogen, which is really very damaging for Dutch farming. And then the fourth party was sort of, you could say, the Christian Democrats in exile, a party called NSC, led by a former Christian Democratic politician, Pieter Omtzigt, who was a fantastic member of parliament, very critical to the government, but was a great failure as party leader. And his party was the number one force obstructing any meaningful reform.
Yeah. And Frank, what lessons, if any, do we draw for wider European politics from what's gone on in the Netherlands? I mean, at one level, it's obviously that actually even winning an election is not necessarily the kind of immediate, it doesn't immediately get you to the point where you've managed to affect meaningful change on migration.
Yeah, I think migration is a very difficult question, because even when you want to contain it, stop it, particularly stop illegal migration, it's almost the case that there are all these institutions whose very existence depends on the perpetuation of uncontrolled immigration coming into Europe. And I just drawn the conclusion that it's no longer possible to realistically imagine that you can stop migration into Europe unless you adopt policies that are much more forceful than they are now. You can't really have minor rule changes, because minor rule changes are not going to get enforced in a kind of effective kind of a way. And it's almost like you need to essentially do what Hungary did, where you just close your borders for a while and see, to what extent you can get on top of the situation. I mean, I'm speaking in particular because I just come back from Britain, which is so out of control that it's almost like it's grotesque. It's almost as if you've given up on trying to secure your borders. But I think we have very similar problems in other parts of Europe as well. And there's no way this is going to improve in any qualitative sense in the period ahead.
Yeah. Well, that brings us on to our next topic. So I wanted to discuss, which has direct bearing on migration, the European Court of Human Rights, or the convention that gives rise to it. It's recently been in the news for a number of reasons. Firstly, there was this joint letter signed by a number of EU member states and signatories to the convention, basically saying that we're slightly worried about. It was very, as Pieter mentioned earlier, very softly worded letter about how they're slightly worried about the beginnings of the kind of politicization of the court and judges going kind of beyond what is in the text to provide so-called rights to people. And then it showed you how much you can't criticize the ECHR, because immediately then court kind of came back saying, members of the court was basically saying, how dare you criticize us? There was official statement saying you can't even begin to criticize us. But getting to grips with the ECHR, Frank, is something that's not really been, it bubbles up in national countries whenever there's a discussion about migration occasionally, but it's not really received much systematic attention.
It hasn't, because a lot of people who should know better treat this court as if it was a court where proper deliberation takes place the way that it would do under a national jurisdiction. They don't realize that the ECHR is a highly politicized institution, and it's basically in the business of establishing a position for itself where it can essentially override decisions that are made within the national domain throughout Europe. And its position is incredibly powerful, because it can thwart decision-making processes just about everywhere. And I think one of the things that I find quite troublesome is that occasionally people criticize, they question a particular ruling, but they don't actually ask the question, how could you have this institution that's that claims to have superior authority and status over national legislation? How could you have a situation where a parliament in Austria or a parliament in Germany or in Holland is inferior in terms of its political authority to this particular court? So that's the first thing. The second thing is I would want people to look at the judges that are making the deliberation. And what I find quite curious is that you can tell in advance that these judges have their own political agenda, and which is a very, very strongly federalist one. They presumably favor a very cosmopolitan orientation in terms of political life, and therefore you can almost predict in advance what their ruling will be months before the ruling is made, just because you know what their track record is.
Yeah, Pieter, is it time to have another look at the ECHR?
Absolutely. It's this debate is long overdue. Mark Bossuyt, who's the former Belgian Constitutional Court president, and who's also the most senior asylum law expert in Belgium. He has been Commissioner General for Asylum. He is a long-time critic of the ECHR, of this court. He has pointed out that they have basically made up, rights, made up all kinds of restrictions for governments to handle asylum. He recently pointed out that the big, migration chaos that we saw in 2015, 2016 particularly, was not so much the result of the war in Syria, but was the result of a number of rulings that prevented Italy from implementing, and Greece, pushbacks on the in the Mediterranean Sea. So I would say these judges. I mean, the European Convention of Human Rights is a fine document. It details human rights, which I think is something that everybody, of course, supports. But the interpretation of these rights is completely ridiculous. Not only on migration, by the way, also there's cases on welfare where they force member states to grant welfare under certain conditions, things that that have nothing to do with human rights, how generous your welfare system is. I mean, that's like human rights are about protecting your property, your free speech. It's nothing to do about like whether you should have free education or not. You could be in favor or against, but that's not human rights. Human rights is sort of a rock basis where the left and the right should agree. We agree on that. And these judges are obviously very leftist. They basically redefine everything that is not in line with left-green orthodoxy as a violation of human rights. So in that sense, I would say they're the greatest opponents of human rights in Europe, because they demean the importance of this.
Yeah, and I mean, that's one of the first things actually leveled whenever someone brings up like either reforming the court or changing interpretation or applying greater national primacy or something. People just say, you're against human rights. Is it like that's the kind of stock answer that prevents any discussion on this topic?
Well, as it happens, I am against human rights because human rights bears no relationship whatsoever to the ideals that were developed in the post-Second World War period, when human rights were fairly modest in terms of the claims that they were making. And they had to do with very kind of fundamental domains of everyday human experience. Like, you look at the situation since, let's say, 1948, what you see is a steady, irreversible expansion of the meaning of human rights. So the meaning of human rights expands and expands. The classic case of what we call concept creep. So that human rights today, as in the way that it's perceived, the way that people talk about it, it's my human right, as if it's a private individual possession, has come to mean something very different than what it was to begin with. And what I worry about is not only the sad career of human rights, its kind of corrupting influence on public life, but what I also worry about is that part and parcel of the enunciation of the Declaration of Human Rights was a growing commitment to promote international institutions at the expense of national ones. Now, obviously, we need international rule of law at a very basic kind of level. But what has happened instead is you had the creation of a very dense network of institutions of which the human rights courts are part and parcel of. And I think that is not very good because it basically undermines democratic decision-making within the nation states.
Yeah, Pieter, it's an interesting question, isn't it? Because we're talking about, in the most part, kind of advanced democracies that have got their own long-established traditions of rule of law, of looking after people's rights for property and speech, whatever, however far we might think that they've gone kind of past some of those today. But so do we even need a supranational institution agreement to enforce those rights?
I'm very skeptical. And the practice have shown that it carries great dangers. You could have made the case back in the day, and maybe it could have gone in a different way. I don't know, but Frank is absolutely right. If you look at the old meaning of human rights, that's also something that I would support. What people today understand under human rights is no longer human rights. It's dramatically broader, and this the criterion should be very simple. If a right cannot be granted to everybody in the world in an unrestricted manner, it's not a human right. That means that protecting your property, you can protect everybody's property perfectly. That is a human right. Same with free speech. All kinds of welfare. You can only get welfare when you sort of damage the property right of somebody else. This tells you in itself that this is not a human right. Now, you may still be in favor of granting welfare or even generous welfare, but if you call this a human right, which universally now many people do, sadly, then I think you're completely undermining the basis of this. Again, it should be something that the left and the right agree on. It should not be, a definition that is ridiculously broad. And that in the case of migration is, you could say, destabilizing European societies, this irregular migration. I'm not talking about 20 people sneaking in. That's always hard to avoid. I'm talking about 1 million in a year basically walking into Europe. So it's not a matter of the problem is not that we don't have enough border protection or something. It's that when people are caught breaking the law and passing the border, that they are told, you can simply stay here. And obviously, what I want to add is that there's a first world country, Australia, that has managed to more or less completely stop illegal migration. So you would think that everybody that means well would say, shall we not have perhaps a closer look at that model? which effectively means having some kind of external return hubs for those denied asylum, meaning that if you sneak in illegally, you can no longer get asylum on the territory of Australia, but only somewhere else. That has worked fine for 20 years, and both the right and the left in Australia have continued that policy. It has problems. We can probably implement it in a better way. But this is still largely a taboo. Yeah, governments once in a while sign up to the idea, but then they never really put the work. Apart from the UK government, of course, with the Rwanda model, but even then, Priti Patel and the people tasked with implementing it were actively obstructed by the administration and their own party.
Yeah. I think the kind of definitive case for the questioning on human rights and the role of the ECHR has been free speech. So supposedly, I mean, by all accounts, freedom of speech, one of the most fundamental rights. And yet we can list, as we've done many times on this podcast, the huge infringements to freedom of speech right across Europe. And you're very unlikely to see a ruling at the European Court of Human Rights holding one of the governments to account for their incredible infringements of speech rights. So I think it's a pretty open and shut case in many ways. So this is not a document that actually protects people's core rights.
Yeah, and I mean, getting rid of the European Court of Human Rights would be a blow for freedom. It's something that would have a very positive effect upon the political climate within European society. And when I think of all the human rights that have been invented, where you have, access to contraceptive pill is a human right. I've got no problem with contraceptive pill, but it's not a human right. Or, children's, right to define their sexuality, it's a human right. And anything that you want to promote, the way you do it is by demanding that it be recognized as a human right. And if you Google human rights, you'd be surprised at the bizarre number of grotesque accomplishments that are meant to be labeled as a human right.
So coming on to our final topic for the week, I want to talk about Emmanuel Macron's latest big idea. Now, I'm not going to say that this is entirely because young people in France are increasingly turning against Macron-style centrism, but Emmanuel Macron has decided that the most important issue is that what we need to do is ban social media for children under 15. He's given a whole number of reasons why this might be important. Obviously, there's a wide debate, not just in France, but right across Europe, about access to pornography, access to harmful content, and so on, and even the so-called damaging effects that screens having on kids' brains. One of the many weird things in this whole discussion was even Macron admitting that he didn't even have the power to do this. This would have to be a European decision anyway. So the debate's kind of a little theatrical, but it does cast a light on what is, I think, Frank, a pretty comprehensive debate that's happening in Europe. And the fact that we're at a position now where something is kind of instrumental and part of everyone's everyday lives as the use of social media, that Macron wants to ban it.
Yeah, I mean, Macron has kind of descended down from the hill of wanting strategic autonomy, his kind of big idea, to the little idea of banning a phone, which at the moment everybody seems to want to do. And the idea that somehow banning a particular technology is somehow miraculously going to lead to the renaissance of European young people is bizarre. I think that there's a tendency, in any case within Europe, to want to ban things. This is really in many ways an expression of Europe's commitment to the precautionary principle, whereby every time, I remember when the phones first started being used, there's all these big debates in Europe about their harmful effect on people's brains. Now that has continued on, and every year or so, there's a new reason as to why this technology is dangerous. And what we're seeing here is a kind of technological determinism, digital determinism, where a whole number of problems are blamed on this technology. Now, I'm not against teachers in classroom. I mean, as a university professor, I told students that they couldn't use their mobile phone during my lectures. And then they protested, but sir, this is how we take notes. And I said, well, use a pen and paper. You're not going to do it in my room because I want your full attention. You can do all that. Parents can be real parents and bring their kids up in accordance with their values and basically tell them not to use mobile technology at the table or at various times. So there are things we can do informally. But the thing that I really worry about here more than anything, obviously nothing's going to happen. Macron has a formidable track record of never achieving anything in terms of policy decisions. But the thing that really, kind of worries me is that at the moment in Europe, you have a tendency to want to formalize what are informal relations. So the relationships between children and parents and technology should be left to families and to communities rather than find a legal solution to them. So I think it's a bad problem. And one of the things that hasn't been mentioned so far is that unfortunately there are a lot of other politicians who should know better all over Europe who have decided that banning the digital technology and protecting children is really the way forward. And I'm quite skeptical about these kinds of projects.
Yeah, Peter, few people would deny that the internet, social media has raised a series of unique challenges that people navigate through their lives. But to ban social media for young people seems rather extreme.
Absolutely. Also, if you look at the actual research, then it's not as conclusive to say that social media is having a harmful effect. Actually, there's very little evidence to prove that. Even if in society, I think there's almost a consensus with many parents, many politicians believing that social media is very harmful for young people. But that's not what the science says. So first. Secondly, the European Union or the French government should obviously not be tasked with this important responsibility. Yeah, maybe parents, for them it may be a good idea to restrict or completely ban social media or certain digital tools for children, but please leave that to the parents or to teachers. The politicians have to stay very far away from this. Now, what we see is that indeed they feel that there's strong resistance to censorship and regulation of social media like Twitter X, which is the marketplace of ideas. Elon has once again proven to be right. The usership of Blue Sky, the supposed competitor, is dropping. Twitter X is the marketplace for ideas, and let's say not everybody is always highly positive about politicians on that forum, which explains why the politicians are desperately looking for any excuse to go after them. And the latest is Mr. Macron describing X as a pornographic platform. Now, first of all, even if it would be, it's not. I don't think the state should be in the business of banning or restricting it. But secondly, if they do it for the children and try to sneak in age verification, well, that means that you do not only bring the children under control, but all the adults, because you have to verify the age. So this is very dangerous. It's similar to the chat control regulations that prosecutors all over Europe are pushing very hard for to fight child pornography. Now, of course, the goal is very good, but the method that they want to use is very dangerous to allow the authorities to scan every WhatsApp message that you send. I don't think we want to go there. And it's good to see not only society, cryptography experts, but also companies resisting this. Signal, the CEO of Signal, or the president of the board rather, she has threatened to pull Signal out of the messaging app, out of the European Union, if the EU goes forward with this. Now, it's still on the table. It's a very dangerous legislative proposal. But yeah, I expect they will keep on trying until they get their way.
Yeah, Frank, it's an important point that it's not, although it's often just presented about protecting children, but that's often the kind of thin end of the wedge when it comes to what is clearly an attempt. I mean, as we're talking, there's headlines about the fact that Pavel Durov, the Telegram chief, is not allowed to leave France. Like, there's clearly, and France seems to be the epicenter of this, which is in some ways not surprising given how much pressure Macron is under politically. But there's a wider context here, Frank, about the attempts to clamp down on what goes on online.
Yeah, I mean, the track record of different moral entrepreneurs seems to be, you mentioned the word children, and nobody's going to basically say we don't care about children, right? It's not, all you got to mention, you add the word child and then issue changes. So these days we use the word child poverty, which is a crazy concept, because it's not the case that you have poor children and rich parents sort of occurring. But by focusing on the child all the time, you invite a kind of moral reaction to it. And politicians have cottoned onto this. And they systematically justify a variety of different measures, particularly in relation to censorship, or at least controlling communication, in the interest of protecting children. So I do think that we need to have a more grown-up discussion about this and understand that children are an integral part of our communities. And the way we try to control or regulate their lives is not something that exists in isolation from what happens in the rest of the community. And I think what Pieter was saying is absolutely the case, that if you begin to clamp down on children online, then that's a prelude to basically extending that to the other age groups. So I do think we need to demystify the use of the child in this kind of manipulative kind of way. And if you want to count the number of moral panics that have been launched about children over the last 25, 30 years, it's quite significant. And most of them have turned out to be just that, panics, rather than real substantial threats to young people.
And Pieter, just finally, it's also worth noting, isn't it, that it's not just kind of free speech that's endangered by these kinds of moves, but also it seems like barely a week goes past without another attempt to clamp down on technology in any kind of way. And it's hardly a surprise that Europe is really struggling when it comes to technology and technology services, when the instinct of every politician is to always add more regulations.
Absolutely. I mean, even GDPR, the GDPR was once hailed in Brussels as the great new data regulation, and the bureaucrats were so proud that they were praised by Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple. And now GDPR has turned out to be sort of a hostile act against innovation, against AI development, a very important, economic sector. I know of, I was told of healthcare companies in Bavaria that are leaving Bavaria because of the GDPR restrictions. Because, for example, when they want to develop a tool by sort of classifying which people have suffered which diseases, even if they make it completely anonymous, it's still illegal under GDPR, at least one interpretation, because it's also very arbitrary. So this is a danger to Europe's future development. Same with the AI Act. I think you will not find an AI expert that is actually in favor of the AI Act. And Mr. Macron himself, the French president, said in December 23 that it's not so smart to come up with regulation of an economic sector when you don't have much of that economic sector. And still it passed, which also tells you something about the crazy, out-of-control Brussels regulatory machine. So yeah, I think we have to really scrap across the board, modeling the Argentinian president, Javier Milei, who's you don't hear about him in the media, which I think tells you that things are going fantastic in Argentina. So I hope that Milei becomes the great policy model for Western countries. They were really at rock bottom, Argentina, and he's really he's done great things there.
Yeah, well, it's a sign of how schizophrenic Macron can be, that you can have him one day criticizing the AI Act, next day he's lobbying for what would be one of the greatest kind of regulations of the internet in since its invention. So, but anyway, that's it for this week on the MCC Brussels podcast. Thanks so much, Pieter, for joining us.
My pleasure.
And Frank, thanks for joining us.
Nice being here.
We'll be back at the same time next week on the MCC Brussels YouTube channel. So make sure that you're like the podcast. If you liked it, give us a comment and make sure you're subscribed to our YouTube channel, because there's plenty more videos and some really interesting deep dives that we've got coming up for you very soon. So see you next week. Very good. Thank you very much.